When I said I'd do anything to make my husband happy, I didn't realize he'd take it this far. It was one thing to imagine what he might ask for. We'd joked around about it. But when he actually brought up inviting 3 of his friends over one evening, I thought he was just testing my reaction. Yet, he was serious. Serious enough that I didn't know if I could say no, or if I even wanted to. I thought my marriage was different, that we were beyond the usual trust issues. My husband and I shared everything. Our hopes, our fears, and yes, even our fantasies. But even in our most playful moments, I never imagined he'd actually push for something like this. Sure, we talked a bit about spicing things up. But to be put on the spot, hearing him say he wanted me to spend the evening with 3 of his friends felt unreal. There was so much running through my mind. Questions, doubts, and even a little bit of excitement mixed in. I kept looking at my husband, waiting for him to laugh and say he was kidding. But his expression was unreadable. Maybe a part of me didn't want him to take it back. The day he told me, I remember feeling a mixture of emotions I couldn't quite explain. I'd always considered myself open-minded, and in our conversations, I'd made it clear that we could explore new experiences together. But this, involving others, felt different. When he told me about his idea, we were having dinner at home. His eyes sparkled with a strange excitement, and he casually mentioned his friends. 3 of them, to be exact. He said he trusted them, that they'd known each other for years, and that they'd been through so much together. But the way he said it, there was an energy that I couldn't ignore, like he was testing to see how far I'd go to make him happy. "Just think about it," he said, almost in a whisper. "They'll be respectful. It's just an experience." I wanted to brush it off, but the way he looked at me made me pause. There was something about his eyes, a challenge mixed with curiosity. I wasn't sure if he was testing my limits or trying to see if I'd be up for this experience he was so excited about. I could have shut it down right there, said no without a second thought. But something held me back. I told him I'd think about it, just to buy myself some time. But deep down, I knew there was more to it than just thinking. I couldn't ignore the thrill, the what-ifs racing through my mind. I was conflicted, torn between wanting to make him happy and wondering why I was even considering it. As the days passed, he brought it up casually, dropping hints, mentioning his friends' names, even saying how excited they'd be. I felt like I was being pulled in different directions. Part of me wanted to say yes, to see where it would lead. But the other part wondered if this was a step we'd never be able to take back. Days turned into a constant tug-of-war in my mind. Every time he mentioned it, I'd feel a mix of curiosity and dread. It was all so new, so unexpected. I kept wondering, was this something I could actually go through with? More importantly, was this something that would change our relationship forever? One evening, he took things a step further, arranging a casual dinner where his friends would come over. "No pressure," he assured me. "Just dinner. You can feel it out. Get to know them." I had no idea if he was actually testing me, or if he thought this was going to help. I didn't even know if I wanted it to help. As his friends arrived, I couldn't deny feeling a strange tension. Each of them was charming in his own way, each bringing a different energy into the room. They were respectful, warm, and somehow comfortable to be around. It threw me off balance. I'd expected to feel awkward or overwhelmed, but their easygoing nature made things feel surprisingly normal. Throughout dinner, my husband kept glancing at me, a quiet anticipation in his eyes. He could sense my hesitation, but also, I think, the curiosity lingering beneath it. Each glance felt like a silent question, nudging me forward, reminding me that he was there, watching how I reacted. And maybe, in some strange way, that comforted me. As the evening went on, I realized my husband wasn't just trying to push a boundary. He wanted me to experience something he felt would bring us closer, something he thought would test and strengthen our bond. He genuinely believed that inviting his friends into this experience would be good for us. And that's what confused me most. After dinner, I found myself sitting in the living room with his friends while he went to grab drinks. The conversation was light, easy, and, to my surprise, even enjoyable. They weren't just his friends now. They were people I'd shared an evening with. People I felt oddly connected to in a way I hadn't expected. We laughed, shared stories, and the tension I'd felt earlier began to ease. But the unspoken understanding lingered. Each of his friends seemed to know about my husband's idea, though none of them mentioned it outright. It was like we were all dancing around it, feeling the tension without saying a word. It was strange and exhilarating, A game of silent acknowledgement that kept me wondering what might happen next. When my husband returned with the drinks, he seemed pleased with how comfortable everyone was. He smiled at me, and I could see the question in his eyes again. That silent, lingering question. My heart raced as I sipped my drink, caught between the desire to please him and the uncertainty of crossing a line we'd never be able to step back over. But he didn't push. Instead, he let the night unfold naturally, leaving me to decide. And as I sat there, I realized that my decision was no longer just about him. It was about me, about what I was willing to risk and how far I was willing to go for this strange new experience he'd brought into our lives. As the evening came to a close, he didn't ask for an answer. He simply watched me, a quiet expectation in his gaze. And as his friends said their goodbyes, I knew that the door was still open, that the choice was still mine. But with every passing moment, I felt myself drifting closer to something I couldn't fully understand, something I wasn't sure I could control. After that night, the idea kept haunting me. It was like a little whisper in the back of my mind, a question I couldn't shake. I didn't bring it up again, hoping that maybe my husband would let it go. But of course he didn't. Instead, he kept hinting at it, slowly and carefully, as if he were planting seeds he hoped would eventually take root. One night, as we were getting ready for bed, he brought it up more directly. "I saw how you connected with them," he said softly, watching my reaction. I think they felt it too. His words sent a jolt through me. It wasn't that I didn't know he was right. I just didn't want to admit it. But in that moment, I felt a strange mix of vulnerability and excitement. It was as if he were giving me permission to explore a side of myself I hadn't even known existed. "What do you want from this?" I finally asked, searching his eyes for any hint of hesitation. But there was none. He seemed so sure, so confident that this was something we could handle. He said he trusted me and that he believed in our relationship enough to push this boundary. I didn't know whether to feel flattered or unsettled. A few days later, he invited his friends over again, this time under the pretense of a casual game night. The energy was different now, charged in a way I hadn't expected. I could feel their eyes on me, a subtle anticipation in each look, each smile. My husband stayed close, watching, almost like he was waiting for something to happen. And as the night went on, I felt that invisible line between what was possible and what was just fantasy blur even further. The game night turned into an evening of shared glances and unspoken understandings. My husband's friends seemed to know the stakes, but they were careful, respectful, almost as if they were waiting for me to make the first move. And with my husband there, I felt like I was safe to explore, that if I were to cross a line, he'd be there to catch me. But I didn't know if I could take that step. I didn't know if I was ready to be the person he thought I could be. My mind was a mix of questions, doubts, and yes, curiosity. As the night went on, I felt myself moving closer to the edge, both mentally and emotionally. I found myself laughing a little too freely, letting my guard down in a way I hadn't planned. My husband seemed to sense it too, his eyes tracking every movement, every word. It was like he could see into my mind, reading every thought that I was too afraid to say aloud. The unspoken game continued, each moment stretching the limits of what felt comfortable, what felt right. I could feel my husband's quiet approval, like he was giving me silent encouragement, waiting for me to embrace this experience he had so carefully set in motion. And I was caught in the thrill of it, unsure of where it would lead, but captivated by the possibilities. When the night ended, there was still no resolution, only the lingering feeling that something significant had shifted. I could see it in my husband's eyes, in the way he held me afterward, as if he were proud of me for stepping closer to the unknown. And yet, I still didn't have the answers I'd been looking for. All I knew was that I'd gone further than I'd ever expected, and there was no turning back now. The days that followed felt like a balancing act, like I was walking a tightrope with no idea if I'd fall or find my footing. My husband was quieter, giving me space but never quite letting go of the idea. I could feel the unspoken question hanging between us. Would I take the next step? And if I did, what would it mean for us? One evening, as we sat alone in the living room, he finally broke the silence. "You know, you don't have to do this," he said, his voice softer than I'd heard it in a long time. I could tell he meant it, that he didn't want me to feel pressured. But I also knew that a part of him was hoping I'd go further, that I'd take this final step and make his fantasy a reality. I took a deep breath. feeling the weight of everything that had led us here. All the subtle glances, the unspoken words, the nights spent questioning what I wanted. And I realized something. This was no longer about pleasing him. It was about me, about pushing my own limits and discovering parts of myself I hadn't even known existed. That weekend, he arranged one final evening with his friends. There was a quiet understanding between us, like we both knew this would be the end of whatever game we'd been playing. Either I would take the step, or we'd leave it all behind. As his friends arrived, I felt the same charged energy from before, but this time, I was in control. I could feel my own confidence, a newfound sense of clarity that surprised even me. They greeted me warmly, each of them aware that this was a night different from the others. My husband stayed close, his presence both comforting and watchful, as if he was ready to step in at any moment if I needed him. We spent the evening talking, laughing, and sharing stories, but the underlying tension was stronger than ever. It felt like every word, every look was building towards something inevitable. But as the night went on, I realized that I had my answer. That I didn't need to go further to find out who I was or what I wanted. As the evening wound down, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. I'd gone as far as I could, tested my own boundaries, and learned more about myself than I'd ever anticipated. But I knew, deep down, that I didn't need to cross that final line. I looked at my husband, and he seemed to understand immediately. There was no disappointment in his eyes, only pride, as if he'd known all along that this journey would lead me right back to where we started, stronger and closer than before. He walked his friends out, each of them sharing a respectful goodbye. And when the door finally closed, it felt like we were the only two people in the world. We didn't need words. The silence between us was enough. A shared understanding that this experience had changed us both, even without the final step. That night, as we sat together in the quiet of our home, I realized that the strength of our relationship had been tested, but it hadn't wavered. We had explored new depths, pushed boundaries, and emerged with a stronger bond and a deeper respect for each other. In the end, I didn't need to go beyond my limits to feel fulfilled. I discovered that the thrill of connection, of understanding, was enough. And that, I knew, was a boundary we would never cross, and never needed to.